Awesome. I think my countdown has already counted down. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining Beneath the Impact webinar. Beneath the Impact, basically, it's a initiative whereby we hope to build knowledge and share knowledge across different change makers. And this is our second webinar, and I'm glad that you have already joined us. So, from the topic itself, the conversation is basically how do organizations learn. So today I'm joined with an extreme person, or rather a person who is a specialist about learning, especially with organizational context. So when we talk about learning, basically sometimes we think of it as a process. Sometimes within other organization, we think of it as a requirement. But in practice, most organizations find themselves collecting data, writing report, and also still asking themselves, are we still learning in itself? So basically today gives us a chance to pause and rethink that. And I'm glad to be joined, as I had mentioned, with Florence Randari. So she's a monitoring and evaluation and learning practitioner with close to a decade experience in supporting programs to move beyond measurement into meaningful learning and adaptation. She worked across development and humanitarian context, helping teams to design systems that just do not generate evidence, but also actually use it to improve decisions and outcomes. She's also a founder of a Learn, Adapt, Manage Network, a growing community that helps rethink how organizations build a culture of learning where curiosity, reflection, and action are part of everyday work. What stands out about Florence is a focus on making learning feel alive again. So hopefully today, by the end of the session, you'll let us know whether within your organization or even within yourself as a practitioner or a person, learning has felt alive again. So basically today we'll explore what it takes for organization to learn, whether it's just tools, frameworks, or it goes beyond that. So Florence, it's a pleasure having you today with us, and over to you.
Thank you for having me, Janie. And hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you to talk about learning. This is something that I care deeply about. So let me share my screen so we can start. Give me a second. Let's see how that goes.
Yes, it's up.
Perfect. Good. See, yes, and it can move. That's good. So welcome so much, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today. As Dennis mentioned, I specialize a lot in supporting teams to figure out how learning can actually be applied. So really moving from the theoretical part of learning to the practical part of learning and how we can do this in our day-to-day work. Today, we are going to look at how organizations learn. And I know this is an important topic because all of you are here and we are having this discussion at this point. So, what I will do is first start with something that feels very familiar to a lot of us. And I want to reflect on one particular incident. A couple of months ago, I was sitting in a program review meeting, as most of you have. Mm, and it's a kind of meeting where everything looks right. The data was there, the analysis was very strong. You could see from the presentations and the dashboards, everything looked okay. And the insights were very clear. So from looking at the discussion, you could tell what was working, what was not working, and the team had discussions on what needed to happen. So that happened. And then a couple of weeks later, I was having a conversation with the same team, and they told me that things were back to normal. And that basically means that after that review meeting, people went back to doing things the way they were doing them. So they were back to doing the same activities, using the same approaches, And the same issues that we had discussed in the review meeting were showing up again, right? And that's when it really hit me at that point about why we put so much effort into learning, but when it comes to really having it move towards informing decisions and influencing what we are doing, it becomes really difficult, right? And this question about how do we learn and how do we move things forward. So just thinking about this story and the question about why we put so much effort into the process of learning, but when it comes to are we learning and how are we using these learnings, how are we using the insights, we have a lot of question marks there. That is what has really defined a lot of my work in the last couple of months, trying to be really specific on identifying where the problem is and what are some possible solutions, right? So we produce a lot of learning. I feel like everyone on this call can probably attest to this, but we don't always use it. A lot of data is out there, it exists. It's not a problem of data anymore. We have insights, right? So we have people who are invested in technologies and in processes of converting this data into insights. And most of us have even gone the extra mile of having reflection moments, right? So these are things that a lot of us in this space are very familiar with. But even after doing all those things, we have moments where decisions don't lead to change, right? They don't always lead to change. And we keep asking ourselves, why is this the case? And that really brings us to a conversation that we are going to be focusing on today. So before we move on, we have a poll that Dennis, I can see you've already launched, so it's live. So I would love to hear from you. What most often happens to insight in your organizations, right? As a starting point to our conversation. Do they inform decisions and changes? Do they spark discussions but little action? Are they documented but not widely used? Are they unclear? Is it unclear on how they are used? So let's see the poll and see if I can have your feedback on this first question. So one of the questions then that we keep asking, right, for team members who have said like they spark discussions, but they don't lead to concrete decisions, or they're documented, but they're not widely used. The question is, why are we not learning if we have data and we have evidence and we have insight and we have reflection meetings, right? So I've gathered from discussions with a lot of people that some of the explanations we try to give is the data is weak. And if you work in a role that is really geared towards data producing or evidence generation, I know how this feels. And sometimes, because I'm a part of that group of people, sometimes you can be very defensive, right? Because people will say the data is weak and we will say, no, it's not. And we have strong methodologies that show that our data is very valid and it's strong. And when we look at the data quality, we can attest to the quality of the data, right? Sometimes the discussion are telling us that we have limited skills within the team to really run the full learning process. Sometimes we hear that it's the leadership team, right? That is not using the evidence, but it's available. So all this explanation independently, they do matter, right? Because if people are raising these issues, then that means there's some truth to it, probably. But the only difference is that they are not the full story in most cases, right? We need to stop thinking about it from a one-dimensional lens to really think about it from a bigger picture. And that is what we are going to be doing today, transitioning to this independent explanation of why we are not learning, either at a program level or at an organizational level, and trying to think about what is the full story about learning in our organization, right? And one thing to remember is that based on the conversations that we have had with multiple people, learning does not stall because people lack competence. This has been the default that a lot of organizations will go to, and they will say, we need to have a training. So I can't count the number of times where people have reached out and they say, Florence, we need you to train our team, because they don't have the competence to either do learning or, operationalize what we have in place in terms of learning and knowledge management. And previously, I have participated in this type of thinking where I say, if the gap is competence, let's put our effort in trying to train people and build their competence. But then after 3 months, after 6 months, go back and have the same conversation with that organization, and we have similar problems of learning not really moving, right? So one of the things that I have identified is that learning stalls because systems are not designed to carry it forward, right? So learning, it's not a one-off activity, which some of us have done, right? We say we have a review meeting, we consider that learning. We say we have an evaluation that we have paid a lot of money for, we say we are doing learning, right? We say we are having an external expert come in and advisors on a specific strategy, and we think that that is learning. But learning really is about the system, and it's about how everything flows through that process. And we are going to be looking deeper into this, trying to figure out how does that actually look like. So moving from the abstract to really figuring out how this works on a practical level. So before we do that, I would love to hear from you. So Dennis is going to launch this poll. If you are able, right on top, it says new poll is live. So if you're working on your computer or your phone, just go and click that purple icon that looks like a graph. If you're not able to do that, we can use the chart. So where does learning most often break down? So can you think about your organization, think about your team, and think about your work? Where does learning most often break down? Is it unclear decisions? Is it because no time is dedicated to interpreting it? Is it because no one owns the actions? Is it because it's usually too late to influence? Or is it because the culture discourages change? Yeah, it seems like insights are generated, but no one is responsible for acting on them. Is winning from the poll side, but also in the church, based on the responses we have. We also have teams rarely have time or space to interpret what the evidence means. That's good. Giving us just one more second to reflect on this. And the reason why this is important is because as we have this next conversation, I would like you to really think about your own work and your organization so that you can pick what is most useful for you, right? Because this looks very different for different organizations. Okay. So everything that you have shared, very valid. We can start seeing where the learning is really breaking down. And we have a sense, just looking at this question, that it is a process that involves multiple stages, right? So it's not a one-off activity. So for learning to move, all the different things that we mentioned really have to be aligned, right? So when we talk about the decision pathways, when we talk about interpretation, when we talk about ownership of the actions, when you talk about the loops, right? So the time that the evidence comes in, the time that the data comes in, it has to be the right time. And also the culture has to support the learning that we want to see, right? So from just looking at your responses, actually all the 5 choices, we had people voting for at least one of these, right? Which tells you all these things have a role to play, but based on your organization, it depends which one is really leading to the breakdown, right? So that's a good place to start up our next conversation. But we agree that learning moves when systems are aligned. So we need to think about those systems and how to ensure that they're aligned. So at this point, I would love to introduce us to what we call the LAM Learning Systems Framework. And this framework has been informed by a lot of work with different organizations at different levels and different team members doing totally different things, where the conversation is always that we are putting in some effort, but when it comes to what we are getting out of this effort, it's difficult for us to articulate, right? And what we found from having all these conversations and from looking at existing theory around organizational learning, behavior change, psychology, is really that we have 5 key conditions that have to be aligned for learning to move, right? So it's a learning system framework that looks at 5 different conditions that have to be aligned for learning to move. So we have the decision architecture, we have collective meaning, we have ownership of translation, we have timely feedback loops, and we have cultural reinforcement. So all these conditions have to be aligned for learning to move. If one of it is not aligned, then we see the gaps in learning that most of you mentioned in the initial poll, where we said insights are there, but they are not informing decisions, or where we said a lot of time is invested in documenting the insights and lively discussions are happening, but nothing is changing beyond that. So we have to think about the full system and identify where the gap is. When it comes to the structural conditions, we're talking about the decision architecture. So the decisions that need to be influenced by learning have to be very clear. And I think this is really calling for a mindset shift in a lot of people, including myself, because I work in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning space. And the first thing that I do in most cases is to look at frameworks like a theory of change, a logical framework, and say, what data are we going to collect? What are the indicators? How can we get this data? And I go straight to designing tools, collecting data, and just presenting that. In very rare cases, do we actually start with what decisions need to be informed by the work that we do. So that is really a mindset shift that we have to consider. So we need to have clear decisions, and also, in addition to that, understand the decision-making authority. So we need to know, if we are talking about resource allocation, who is responsible for managing that? And the conversations about decisions, they need to be had with that specific person so that it can be very clear to us on what type of information is needed to influence the decisions that are being made at different levels. When it comes to timely feedback loops, one thing that we have seen is that data, in terms of the production of data, in terms of evidence generation, this happens continuously in a lot of organizations. At any point, we are generating data, right? We are having conversations with different stakeholders. We are getting feedback about how our work is going and the impact of our work. But decisions are made periodically, right? So we have decisions that probably are made on a quarterly basis. We have decisions that are made on an annual basis, and that looks different for different organizations. Some of them are aligned with donor strategies and when new funding is announced. So decisions are made periodically, but our data is mostly coming in continuously. So what we need to ensure is that we align the learning with exact decision-making points. It's really, really important that we start thinking about the decision points and ask ourselves, at this point where a critical decision is being made, what learning needs to have happened and what type of evidence needs to be availed at that point. Okay. Another thing is, when it comes to the process, we need to think about collective meaning. And this is critical because in a lot of our spaces, we interact a lot with people who are probably more focused on data analysis. We have experts in producing dashboards that are very great, and we have visualization teams, which is amazing. But the literature has told us that data by itself, especially raw data, when it's just numbers, it rarely informs decisions. What informs decision is shared interpretation of the data, right? And that is why you may have had a lot of conversations in my own writing. I really look at, what do we do beyond the dashboard? Because some of us will default to, let's have a dashboard. That's exciting. But that doesn't mean a lot when it comes to learning and evidence-informed decision-making. What is critical is shared interpretation. So we have to think about that in our work. Then the other thing is ownership of translation. So going back to the story I shared at the beginning of this webinar about teams coming together, spending time figuring out what's working, what's not working, and having a discussion about what does this really imply for our work. But then coming back a few weeks later and just saying that things are the way they used to be. People are doing the same things, they're having the same issues, we're going back to the same conversation. What that tells you is that the teams were not able to carry forward the learning from this conversation. So learning needs a career. We need to have ownership and clear responsibilities on who is going to move this forward. In most organizations, this is lacking because it's not something concrete. The way we have a finance department that is responsible for finance or HR department, right? We don't really have a department that's really like, we are going to own the learning and translate it, because this can be cross-cutting across different roles. So we need to think critically about who is the carrier of the learning. Because without these two process conditions, insights do not become actions, right? They're just like good discussions and good reports, but they do not translate to action. And then we have the cultural condition. So this is a topic by itself that I have explored before in detail. But when we think about learning and evidence-informed decision making, we can't ignore the role that culture plays. So we need to start asking ourselves, is it safe to question things the way they are working, right? Do we have incentives in the organizations that reward learning, that reward adaptive management, right? So this is something that we have to think about as we think about our system of learning in the organization. Psychological safety for people who are bringing up the ideas about what is not working, right? Incentives for people who are trying out things and saying this is failing and we need to redesign how we are doing things. So we really need to think about those cultural elements and what is rewarded versus what is punished within the organization. Do we have incentives to support learning and adaptation at the organizational level? So culture determines if learning is going to survive in your organization, right? So just to bring it back together again, learning is a process. We have to think about the whole process. From what decision are we trying to inform to what does that actually look like, right? In terms of what evidence comes in, how is that evidence interpreted and by who owns the translation of the evidence? Do we get the evidence at the right time when decisions are being made, right? And do we have a culture that can really support this learning culture that we're looking to create within the organization? So just to emphasize that learning is not a data problem, as most people will say when they're really pushing for organizations to invest money in producing a lot more data, right? Or into heavy technology that will help us have more data. It's more about the system, right? Strong data doesn't always equal good decisions or decisions at all. So that should probably not be the sole focus of our conversations if we're looking at championing data use in our organization or championing learning and adaptive management in our organization. Reflection by itself doesn't lead to adaptation. And this point is close to my heart because I have dedicated a lot of my years in this career to designing effective reflection meetings and workshops. But I have learned from experience that having a great reflection meeting, having really good discussions, does not always equal adaptation. We have to think about ownership of that and the culture within the organization as well. Learning only moves when the system connects these different things. We can't have breakdowns in between and expect to call ourselves a learning organization. We need everything connected. So, as part of my wrap up, I would love to hear from you from the final poll. Which area feels most fragile in your organization? So, if you reflect on the things that we have discussed, which area feels most fragile in your organization? Is it the decision clarity? Is it the shared interpretation? Is it ownership of action? Is it timing of learning? Or is it culture? I would love to hear from you. If you are unable to access the poll, please put in the chat your answer. I would love to hear from you. Thanks. I can already see that we have votes coming in. And thanks to the people who are doing it in the chat as well. I appreciate that. Good. I'm also seeing really familiar names. So I'm also happy to see Ashanafi, to see Samuel, who are my colleagues. Good to see what is coming in. So I think we have some votes around clarity, around decisions. That has been, I think, one of my struggles doing this work. We have a lot of people actually on the poll voting to the culture. So a culture that supports reflection and course correction seems like it's a bit fragile in some organizations. Some people also talking about clear responsibility for turning insight into action is something that is missing. Good. So as you can see, this varies across different organizations. So there is no straight answer for this on how do we make or how do we create learning organizations. I think the strength that all of us who are in this webinar today, the strength that we have is that now we are informed about the full system. And when we have conversations in our organization, in our teams, we are going to have a wider perspective about what are the different things and how we can address them. I think that's really the win that we are taking away from this conversation. So finally, as I wrap up, I want us to remember that the challenge is not for us to produce more learning, especially if you're working in a space where you are an evidence producer or you're producing evidence. Don't think about the challenge as I need to produce more data. I need more evidence. I need to use multiple methodologies to prove something. I need to invest more money. Don't think about that as the challenge. Think about how do you design systems in which learning moves? How do we design systems where learning moves? So let's not think about effort alone. Let's think about progress and how this looks like in our organizations as we move forward. So thank you so much. I will hand it over to Dennis for the Q&A session. I would love to answer as many questions as possible. or also hear from other team members about your own experience.